Hey, good morning. I'm so glad that you are here. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Mike Packer, and I'm the lead minister here at Southeast. And if you're new to Southeast, I'd love to shake your hand. I'll be out in the lobby on the red carpet following the worship service. We are in a sermon series kind of going through the first few chapters of creation. And I think this is incredible because at least what I believe, what we kind of get traditionally is that as God was pulling the Israelites out of bondage, out of slavery in Egypt, they had the prophet Moses. And Moses was given the law, the Torah, and he was given them this. And these stories, these events, these narratives that we have are really the start of a nation. It's the start of a nation. And I think that these principles that we learn in the first few chapters of Genesis are important for us to kind of get our bearings. And some of you might be going through a difficulty. You might be going through your own kind of rebirth. You might be going through just some challenges and trying to figure out things. And it's always helpful to kind of pause and get back to the fundamentals. And so that's kind of what we've been doing over the last couple of weeks is just kind of pausing and looking at the fundamentals. And one of the things is that God is other than us. Like God is other than us. He created, He spoke things into existence. He is not part of the creation. He created the creation. Right? Like He did it. He spoke and He calls it, the Bible tells us He calls out the stars by name. And that's just a beautiful picture to me. And He puts us in this incredible environment. He makes all these things, and then He looks at you and me, He makes you and me, Adam and Eve, and He says, it is very good. And it's this creation, and He says, I'm going to take care of you. Whatever you need, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to watch over you. Here's the thing. I just want you to trust me. You know, and a lot of people, when they look at the creation accounts, and they look at Adam and Eve, and they're like, really? Like, they ate a piece of fruit? But man, it's so much deeper than that, isn't it? Because what they were really saying is, hey, God was saying, I want you to trust me. And they said, you know what? We think you're holding out on us. We think that if we just ate from this tree, we would become like you. And that was the lie that the serpent gave them. And so God kicked them out of the garden. And, you know, He kicks them out of the garden. And so then they start living east of Eden. East of Eden, and they have the child, and Cain kills Abel. And in this moment, we see kind of what it's like to live without God. To live not in His presence. And we just kind of feel this spiral that's continuing even today. And you can feel it. You can see it. You can feel it. You can look up, and you think about God and creation and all that stuff, and it's like there seems to be something. It's not the picture that we get of Adam and Eve walking with God in the garden. There seems to be something that's broken. And we can see it in our relationships. We can have conversations with people and have a great conversation and then walk out and be like, that didn't go the way that I thought it was supposed to go. And our relationships are damaged. Like we can feel what it's like not to live in the garden. And we long for that. And Derek, in the middle of this, I love this passage. If you have your Bible, turn with me to, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 6. But before you turn there, Genesis chapter 3, and I didn't have them put this on the screen. But here's what it says in Genesis 3:15. This is the curse. As God was looking at the serpent, He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. That's the first gospel message. That's the first euangelion. That's the first time that God's saying, I'm going to take care of this. You sinned, you sinned, and when you sinned, it broke your relationship with me, and it broke your relationship with each other. But I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to give you this promise. And last week I was out of town, and so Dr. Derek Voorhees, he preached for me, and I love Derek. I hope he was fantastic for you guys. But he said, he talked about how the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5 is a promise of that life. And so that's what we see in Scripture, is we see a promise of life threaded throughout all of Scripture. And so we get that, but here's the thing, is that we still live in this brokenness. We're holding on to the promise of life. But man, the world hurts sometimes, doesn't it? Man, the world hurts sometimes. And I'm here to tell you that in this brokenness, in this pain, that God is there and He will not abandon you. And He will comfort you. And He will comfort you through His Word. He will comfort through His Spirit. He will comfort you through the church if you allow Him to. And so in Genesis chapter 6, here's kind of what happens. So 5 was kind of this, here's the generations, and we have this new birth. Like God is going to start over with this. And so we turn to Genesis chapter 6, and here's what happens, and it's the story of the flood. And I know like a lot of people, they're like, really, a flood, a global flood? Like, are you kidding me? And here's what I kind of think. Jesus rose from the grave, and He seemed to think that these were real events, and so that's kind of where I land. You don't have to land there, but then you can tell Jesus He's wrong when you get to heaven. That was a little funny. All right, so here's what happens. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any that they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. So here's the question. Who are the sons of God? Now keep in mind, we haven't got to the next verse. So if you're reading ahead, stop. Go back to these previous verses. But the question is who are the sons of God? Who are these sons of God? And there's 3 possibilities. One is this, is that, and this is kind of the romantic side of people, and it's kind of like they like the supernatural side of people, that they think that it's some sort of divine agent. So the sons of God could be some sort of divine agent, which this means it could be like you have God and you have like Elohim, like creator God, and He is like premium, and then you have other deities, or it could be like angels. So angels were giving themselves into marriage. That's one thought that's out there. And I don't really land on that thought. There's some arguments for it. They're just not convincing for me. You might find them convincing for you, but for me, they're not convincing. Another thought is this, is when you look at the sons of God, we kind of see this in the Roman culture. So in the Roman culture, you had Caesar, and what did Caesar call himself? He said he was a son of God. And so there's this idea that it could be kind of this hierarchy, or this kind of if they were the kings of the people that were around at the time. And that one's not really convincing for me either. The one that's convincing for me, at least today, as I'm preaching today, so you listen to the sermon a couple of years from now, I might have changed my position. But the one that's convincing for me is that you have the line of Seth. So Cain killed Abel, and then you had Seth kind of took his spot as kind of the running the promise that we found in Genesis 3:15 through the genealogy. And you have the line of Cain. And I don't know that it's specific to people, but I think what they're doing, what the author is doing, is he's showing a contrast between the way of the Lord, the way of God, and the way of the world. The kingdom of God versus the kingdoms of today. And that's kind of where I land right now. And I think that we see this today, even where you have people, and I think that, if we're honest with ourselves, we look in the mirror, I think there's places where God could convict us to say, hey, you know what? If you've surrendered your life to Christ, you are a child of the living God. You have been chosen, you have been accepted, you have been forgiven, you have been redeemed, you have been given grace, you have been sealed with my Spirit, and you have been given purpose in life. And we hold on to that identity, but sometimes we do things that don't line up with that identity. And I think what God was doing here, what the author is showing us here, is that there were people who were focused on Elohim, on Yahweh, on the God of creation. And they were synchronously living with the world. Now, I could be wrong. But that's where I land today. And so God says, I'm not going to contend with that. My spirit, he specifically says, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, or I will not contend with that. Do you understand how jealous God is for you? Do you understand how jealous God is for you? And so he limits the span of life to 120 years. And then it goes on and it kind of gives a commentary on this. So here's the other question. If you read ahead, you got to this word. And it's the Nephilim. In verse 4, it says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And again, we don't really know who they are. The Nephilim was referred to later in the text as giants. So it could be that they're giants. It could be a descriptive of these sons of God. We just don't know. What we do know is that the culture was moving away from God. And we see this kind of spiral out. And so today we're going to look at three things. We're going to look at the violence of men. We're going to look at the response of God, the pain of God, and we're going to look at the way out of both of these things. So the first one is the violence of man. Look at the description here, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time with this because I just don't have to spend a lot of time on this. The violence of men, in verse 5, it says this, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's the point. That's where it got to. When you move from the garden to east of Eden, if we keep going in this spiral, it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And you and I can feel this. You and I can feel this in a good way, which eventually turns into a bad way. Imagine if you are a little child and your parents say to you, hey, go into the candy store, pick out anything you want, and you start eating all the candy you want in the world. And you just eat. And if you're me, my favorite candy bar, hint, is a Reese's. But after a while, how many Reese's do you think that you can pack down? And I don't care who you are. For you, it might be 3. For me, it's probably like 10. There are some of you that could probably pack down way more than that. But at some point, you're just going to be like, I've had enough. Right? You're just going to exhaust yourself from intaking whatever it is. And that could be something that's good. Some of you are struggling this with in your career. You get a job and you're thinking, man, this is the job I've been waiting for. This is the job I've been hoping for. This is the job that I went to school for, and now I'm here and I have it. And then a few weeks go by, a few years go by, and all of a sudden it's like, you know what? I kind of want something more. And I want something more. And I want something more, 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 and it never stops. There is no satisfying your flesh for something more. But it goes in the other direction too, doesn't it? We were talking a little bit in our Bible study this morning about addiction. And how a lot of times what happens is people don't want to be addicted. Sometimes it just happens. Where it's just kind of this little edge, like you have that moment where sin is crouching at your door. You say, I'm just gonna dance with it for just a little bit. I'm just gonna taste just a little bit. And pretty soon that taste turns into a meal, And the meal eventually turns into a lifestyle. And you wake up one day and you're just like, how in the world did I end up here? Because your flesh can never be satisfied if you just keep feeding it. And this is the spiral that was happening out of control as the people moved east of Eden, that violence just continued and continued and continued, and we see it still today. And we look at that and we think, man, how could God do that? How could God allow that? And that's why I'm so grateful for this next verse. In verse 7, look at what it says. In verse 6, look at what it says. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. One of the key principles that we talked about already is that God is utterly other than creation. So when you think about it, God could have created something and then he could have easily just said, you know what, I'm done with it, and he walks away. He could have just been, I gave them their chance. I'm done with it. They're kind of these people here. And in fact, in one of the, as we look at the creation stories in the Bible, we recognize that there are other creation stories throughout different cultures. And there's other flood narratives in different cultures. And one of the creation stories, one of the flood narratives talks about how that it was flooded because people are annoying. Not because they grieved because of the violence that was happening, but because they were making too much of a racket. They were frustrated because of the noise that people were making. And what we see here is something quite different, because what we look at it is that while God could have walked away, he didn't walk away, and instead what he does is he knits his heart with people. He knits his heart with you. You're the prize of creation. People are what this is all about. And so when he sees people going in the direction of violence and wickedness, his heart hurts too. And so as we're looking at this stuff that's happening in Israel and the Gaza Strip, as we look at the things that are happening in Africa, as we look around and we see the pain that is happening throughout the world, whether it's wars and rumors of wars and all the stuff that goes with it, or if it's starvation, or, on that grand scale, we look at it. And as much as we're upset with it, God is more so. As much as you and I are angry about it, God is more so. And I would argue that it's not just on a grand scale. Peter tells us, when he writes to the church in Rome, he tells us to cast all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. He loves you. He knows you. And so the anger that you feel on the grand scale, you might be like, well, my life, my troubles are not as big as that. I mean, I'm dealing with this person at work, and there's this broken relationship at work, and it's just, there's rumors and all this backstabbing and all this stuff that's going on. I would argue that God's heart breaks for that as well. That when you have these disappointments where you are, hey, I know this is what God has called me to, and you're moving towards that, and you hit this obstacle, and it's like, I've got to give up on this dream and this hope. And I would say that God hurts for that too. You see, that's what's so amazing about the God that you and I worship, is that God didn't create and then walk away from his creation. God created with his fingerprints all over creation. And then he puts himself in it. And so as we're looking at this, and we're seeing the violence, we're seeing the destruction, we're seeing people do things that were never intended to be done. God looks at that and his heart grieves. More than you and me. So in verse 7, he says this. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creepy things and birds of the heavens, for I'm sorry that I have made them. Now, I'm very much, a lot of times people come up to me and they're like, well, what do you think about these Psalms, that talk about a nation and all that stuff? And they talk about the prophecies, and I'm very much that the wrath of God is not always a lightning bolt. I think it can be, but I think that a lot of times when we think about the wrath of God or the blessings of God, it's moving in line with the gospel or it's moving out of line with the gospel. So a lot of times the wrath of God, if you look in Romans chapter 1, it says that God gave them over to what they wanted. So that's part of the wrath of God, right? It's your hands off. And so you look at some of those Old Testament passages, and especially like when you think about like prophecy, most of prophecy in the Old Testament and even the New Testament is looking back at Christ. Like most of it is not the second coming of Christ. Most of it is the first coming of Christ, and it's also coming back to the covenant. Right? Hey, if you don't come back to the covenant, then Assyria is going to come. Right? Like if you're not in line with God's will, with God's covenant, Assyria is going to come down. Babylon's going to come down. Egypt is going to destroy it. Like that's a lot of prophecy. And so we can look at that and we go, yeah, you can't really do that with this passage. This is one of those passages where it's like, it's right there. It is the wrath of God. I'm wiping them out. I'm starting over. There's no kid gloves here. It is major, major wrath of God terrifying the world. And honestly, like if you're like real, like if you are a real human being and you are breathing, that should make you feel uncomfortable. It should. How can we worship a God who wipes out humanity? Like that's a tough question. And so a lot of people get there and they look at that and they go, you know what? I'm done. That's it for me. I'm going to walk away from Christianity. I'm going to walk away from Judaism. Whatever it is, I'm going to walk away from that because I can't believe in a God who is wrathful. I believe in a God who is love, and we just ought to encourage everybody. I don't believe in a God of wrath. There's a problem with that, though. Yes, there is angst when we think about a God with wrath. I fully agree with that. But there's more angst if you believe in a God who is not wrathful. Because if you believe in a God who is not wrathful, who has no wrath, who has no justice, then guess what? That's up to you. It's on your shoulders. You have to deal with it. And so we look out and we see the world and we see in nature. We were up, so when I was on vacation last week, we were up in nature. And nature is a very, very harsh reality. You think about we do this leaf drive. Anybody ever do the leaf drive here? You go up the Alpine Loop. We didn't do the whole Alpine Loop, but we went up there, and we kept saying to our kids, "Oh, those are beautiful leaves. Look at the leaves." And our kids kept saying, "Look at the trees dying. Look at them all die." Nature is harsh. And we don't get upset at that because that's just nature. But if there's not a wrathful God, then who are we to say? If there's not a God who is about justice, then you and I have no right to say this nation should not invade another nation. That's just the way of it. The strong survive, and the weak will die. And the reality is too, if on top of that, there's an emotional issue too, because it's not just on the grand scale of things, it's on the emotional issue. Why should you have any moral outrage when you see injustice being done? And our moral outrage actually becomes a power play to put us up on top. And I think that's especially true today. I don't really have to deal with the injustices that are happening as long as I am perceived at being outraged. I don't really have to do anything about the injustice that I see. I can just change my social media status. I can get the bumper sticker for the car. I can put the sticker on the laptop. I don't really have to change anything. I can just criticize the power structures because that makes me feel like I'm above everybody else. You see, here's the problem. Here's the problem, though. This is the core of it. If you believe in a God without justice, if you don't believe in the wrath of God, you will be forced to take up the sword. And that sounds good. For some of you, it's probably fantastic. The problem that I have with that, though, is I know myself. And I know that I don't know everything. I'm not omnipotent. I'm not omniscient. I do not know everything. I forget what I had for breakfast yesterday. So to put godly justice in my hands, that's not a wise thing to do. And so for us, it's surrendering that to God. It's surrendering that to Him. But what we see in this, though, here's the thing that you and I need to make sure that you and I understand about this, is as God is pouring forth His justice, what does He do is He provides a way of salvation through His judgment. Look in verse 8. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. It's all grace. It's all grace. We're going to get to kind of the rest of the ark story next week, and we're going to get into the covenant. But you and I know how it finishes, right? We know how it finishes. We have this thing where Noah gets into the ark with Mrs. Noah and Ham, Shem, and Japheth and their wives, and they have this fantastic, nice cruise. Hopefully they didn't do too much barbecue. But they had this cruise out there, and they come off, and immediately, what happens? Noah sins. Now, for you and I, this should be a warning, right? Like, this should be a warning for us, because a lot of times what happens is that we look at people and we think, man, if we could just get the bad eggs out of here, then everything would be right. You look at your company, you look at your church, you look at your family, you look at any sort of social environment, you look at it and you go, man, things are great if it wasn't for this person. If we just got rid of this person, that'd be fantastic. Life would move on. It would be nice. Essentially, that's what God did. But here's the thing that you and I forget about when getting onto the ark. What did Noah take onto the ark? Well, he took on the animals, but he also took his family and he took his wife. But what else did he take with him? He took his sin with him. And that's the problem. And so as we look at this story, we look at the three things, right? We look at the violence of man, we look at the care of God, and we look at the judgment and the salvation. We see that the Noah story, the flood story, is actually simply just pointing us to something greater. It's pointing us to something greater. And look at the passage here. This is in 1 Peter 3, 20 through 22. It says, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of the dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience. Now here's the thing, listen to this, catch this. Through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. That's our ark. Jesus is our ark. Jesus is the one. That's who we're putting our faith into. Right? Like that's the story, is that there is God's judgment that is coming. There is God's wrath that is out there. And when you and I surrender our lives to Christ, he promises to resurrect us. But here's the key difference. Noah went into the ark with sin. Jesus was without sin. Jesus was without sin. In fact, and I kept going back and forth, and I'm just going to use both passages. But 2 Corinthians chapter 5, look at what it says. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, it says this, for our sake he made him, that's Jesus, to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. You see, when you and I put our faith in Christ, then he takes his Spirit and he seals us with it, but he forgives us of all of our trespasses. And the Bible tells us that we are new creations in him. And that's this incredible thing. And so I guess that's really what I have to say today. As you look at the flood story and you think about God's wrath, you have to also think about the heart of God who is grieved over that. But not only that, how judgment, that we are saved through judgment. In fact, here's where it says it more concisely. Justice and love are satisfied on the cross. You see, what do you do with your sin? If you can't just ignore it, because if you ignore it, then you don't have a very good God who is just. You have to deal with it. But God just can't obliterate you, because if he does that, then that's not very loving, right? So in order to be 100% love and 100% just, Jesus became sin and died in our place.